The Maternal Thread by C.J. Van Pletsen. The Mask of Reputation. By 1930, Estes was no longer just a vineyard. It was a name whispered among merchants in Rotterdam, Hamburg, Milan. His wines never appeared on lists, never adorned shelves. They were hidden, treasured, exchanged like relics in circles of power. A dozen buyers only, each hand-picked by Zuriel himself, each bound not only by contract, but by silence. To drink Estes was not merely to taste wine, but to receive initiation into a fellowship invisible to the world. To the public eye, Lars Smit was nothing more or nothing less than a settler-turned-entrepreneur, a quiet genius who had coaxed order from wilderness. The Cape papers occasionally wrote of him as a man of discipline, a figure of industrious modernity. But he declined interviews, shunned gatherings, and left no photograph for their archives. He let them guess, and the guessing served him better than truth ever could. To his family, he was a husband of constancy. He never raised his voice to Miriam, though he could be stern with silence. He carried Frederick on his shoulders through the vineyards, taught him to touch the vines as if they were living kin. He braided Elsa's hair with the same concentration he gave to pruning branches, his hands surprisingly gentle for one who had once held a soldier's blade. And yet, to his children, he was not soft. He demanded order at the table, discipline in their studies, and reverence in the church pews. He loved them as a smith loves the metal he hammers through pressure, through form, through fire. They grew under his gaze as vines grow under a vintner's blade, shaped, pruned, directed toward the fruit he intended them to bear. The hidden chamber. But behind the mask of farmer, father, husband, there remained the man no one in the Cape knew. In the farmhouse stood a study whose door was always locked. The key lay upon his chest at night, never on a hook, never in Miriam's hand. Few entered, and none lingered. On the wall hung a single oil portrait, a Prussian soldier, unnamed, stern, faceless in its anonymity. The eyes seemed to follow whoever dared to glance at it, as if keeping watch. Beneath that portrait lay the true heart of Estes and the true heart of Zuriel himself. There, upon a great oak desk, under lamplight that burned late into nights when even the vineyards slept, he drafted pages no one else would ever see. Ledgers, maps, designs. Not of soil or rainfall this time, but of something older. Schematics of alliances. Symbols drawn from the notebook Eric had left him. Family trees that wound like vineyards, stretching back to Babel and forward into futures no historian would write. Words in Latin, Greek, and the coded tongue of the Brotherhood. It was here alone that Lars Smit dissolved, and Zuriel returned. Zuriel the architect, Zuriel the heir of shadows, Zuriel who carried in his blood not only survival, but a purpose that the world itself seemed to resist acknowledging. And though no one could hear him in those nights, sometimes he whispered to the portrait above him, as if to the soldier were a mirror. Not forgotten, not broken, only waiting. The ledger of shadows, the study smelled of lamp oil, ink, and oak. Nights stretched long there, the Cape wind rattling the shutters while Miriam and the children slept in the rooms beyond. Zuriel, though the world knew him as Lars Smit, sat at his desk, quill poised like a soldier's blade, every stroke measured, every line etched with a gravity that bent the air around him. It was here that the Ledger of Shadows was born. It was not merely a book. It was not merely a record. It was a covenant, drafted in secret, layered in cipher, a scripture for a future that had not yet arrived. The pages carried no titles, no names. Each entry was bound in a hand few could decipher, its letters interwoven with numerals, geometric shapes, and symbols pulled from alphabets long buried. It was at once blueprint, prophecy, and ledger, a bridge between bloodlines and empires, between the ashes of what was lost and the architecture of what would be. The seal. The first pages bore a symbol he had designed himself, a seal that was no single inheritance, but many bound together like strands of iron in a blade. The Anak star mark, sharp and six-pointed, the ancient sign of a people said to have walked with giants. The sigil of ash, carved once in desert caves, said to be older than Babel. The Valknut of the Norse, 3 interlocked triangles, a knot of fate and death. The lion rampant, drawn with claws unsheathed, the beast of Judah, but also the predator of kingdoms. And the cross of the Teutonic Order, stark and uncompromising, the iron faith of warriors who had once carried banners into Prussia. He merged them into a single crest, a seal that spoke of many roots and one trunk, a mark no empire could claim, and yet all empires would one day recognize. He pressed it onto the page in ink so dark it drank the lamplight. To Miriam, to his children, to the farmhands who passed the door, it was meaningless, just another sketch of his eccentric solitude, but to him, it was a banner planted in time itself. The design, the ledger unfolded not as a farmer's account, but as a strategist's map stretched across generations. It spoke of land strategies not only in the Cape, but across Africa and Europe. Farms disguised as estates, estates disguised as sanctuaries, holdings in names that were not his, stitched through the continents like hidden arteries. There were accounts in Geneva, where Swiss silence could shield wealth for centuries, and vaults in Buenos Aires, far from the reach of European wars. Coin was not merely coin to him. It was seed, scattered for a harvest his grandchildren would reap. The instructions turned personal. His descendants, those yet unborn, would be trained not merely to inherit land, but to rule within it. They would learn languages, for empire is a tongue. They would learn war, for inheritance is defended with steel. They would learn diplomacy, for alliances last longer than armies. And they would learn finance, for numbers are the true soldiers of the modern age. It was no vanity project, no desperate attempt to immortalize himself in parchment. This was vengeance, sharpened by foresight, a design to outlive death, to seed permanence in a world where bloodlines had been scattered, betrayed, and forgotten. The warning. On the night he sealed the first pages, Miriam entered quietly. She moved with the grace of one who had long since learned not to startle him at his desk. The lamplight haloed her hair, turning her presence into something half vision, half flesh. She did not ask what he wrote. She had never asked. She only laid her hand upon the desk, her fingers brushing the edge of the seal he had drawn. She stood for a long while in silence, as if listening to something he could not hear, or hearing more deeply the silence itself. Then she said only, "What you build must be strong enough to hold the weight of what's coming." Her voice was not fearful, nor was it tender. It was steady, like a judge delivering sentence. Zuriel did not ask what she meant. He did not need to. He already knew. He had once vowed to be the architect. Now he built for the crown. And so, as the ink dried and the pages grew, the brotherhood of ash thought broken, thought scattered to dust, was restored in silence. Not in public, not in proclamation, but in the marrow of design, in the dark weight of foresight pressed into a book no one else would ever hold. The ledger of shadows was not finished that night. It would grow page upon page, through years, through wars, through births and burials. but its first breath had been taken, and once begun, such breath could not be recalled. The vineyard as fortress, Zuriel rose before dawn, when the mist still clung to the hills and the first birds had not yet broken the silence. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of earth and fermenting grapes. Lantern in hand, he walked the vineyard rows not as a farmer greeting his crop, but as a soldier patrolling a perimeter. His gait was measured, his eyes sweeping the lines with unblinking precision. Each trellis was inspected not merely for fruit, but for strength. He pressed his palms to the wood, tested the posts for weakness, and noted where repairs were needed. Irrigation ditches traced the contours of the land, feeding vines with captured rain. Yet anyone who had marched in war would have recognized their second purpose. Dug deeper, reinforced, they were trenches in disguise, channels that could guide not only water but men. Boundary stones marked the edges of the estate. To neighbors, they were simple measures of property, but each was carved with a subtle mark, a symbol no farmer would ever notice, and placed with military precision. From one marker, a man could signal to another with a flicker of fire or mirror. The estate was mapped with the discipline of a battlefield. The cottages built for workers stood at angles that seemed accidental, until one realized they formed a ring of sightlines across the valley. A fire lit in one hearth could be seen by another, and then another, spreading word across the vineyard like a pulse of flame. Even the wine cellars dug deeper than grapes required, lined with stone thick enough to withstand time, were designed not merely for barrels, but for people. Storage became shelter. Fermentation vaults became strongholds. To the casual eye, Estes wine farm was a place of pastoral beauty, a sanctuary of ordered rows and fertile abundance. To those who studied more closely, the truth emerged. The land itself had been reshaped into a shield. Every vine, every trench, every wall whispered of readiness. The estate was not only a farm, it was a fortress wearing the mask of peace. Zuriel had once promised himself he would never be caught unprepared again. The vineyard was his oath made manifest, Miriam's second sight. At dusk, when the last light spilled gold over the valley and shadows stretched long between the vines, Miriam often walked with him. Barefoot, she moved quietly, as if her steps were part of the land's own rhythm. Her hands trailed along the leaves, fingertips brushing them as if listening for secrets. The workers said she walked like a woman in prayer. Zuriel knew better. She walked like one who heard. Sometimes she would stop suddenly, her gaze fixed on nothing visible, and her voice would fall into words that chilled him more than any desert night. "The soil remembers who walks on it," she murmured once, her hand pressed to the ground, as though feeling for a heartbeat beneath the earth. Another evening, she lingered before a thick vine, one whose roots had sunk deeper than all others. She touched it as if it were alive, then whispered, "Strength is never safe. It either protects or destroys." Zuriel never asked her what she meant, never demanded an explanation. He had learned not to. He suspected that, like him, Miriam carried a thread of something older, something inherited from a time when families still heard echoes of God or angels or things neither named. Her words rose from that well, unbidden. He knew better than to disturb it. To him, Miriam became more than wife, more than mother. She was conscience. The vineyard was his fortress, but she was its soul. Where he saw defense, she reminded him of mercy. Where he planned for vengeance, she spoke of inheritance. Her presence softened the iron with which he shaped his children, reminding him that vineyards grow not only by pruning, but by patience. Yet she also understood him when his eyes grew haunted at night, when he woke with clenched fists as though still gripping a sword. Miriam would lay her hand over his chest and whisper, "Do not forget, you are building for those who come after." In that touch, in those words, the vineyard's true purpose took root, not merely as fortress, not merely as vineyard, but as legacy.